Hello, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Consortium of Indo-Pacific Researchers. I'm Indu Saxena, Senior Fellow and the Chief Operation Officer at the Consortium. Today, this session is focused on the examining U.S. grand strategy and Euro-Atlantic cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. I am pleased to facilitate this session with Consortium intern Chrysula Kokinau. She has joined from Seoul, South Korea. For this very important topic, we have the star panelists and speakers for this session. We have the Professor Simon Reich and Hannah Gass. I would like to take a moment to introduce both of our panelists here. Simon Reich is a professor at the Division of Global Affairs and Department of Political Science at Rutgers Newark campus. He also holds an appointment as a Chercheur Associate at the Center for International Studies at Sciences Po Paris. Prior to the Rutgers University, he worked at the University of Pittsburgh Graduate School of Public and International Affairs for over 2 decades, including serving as the inaugural director of the Ford Institute for Human Security. Professor Reich has been the recipient of numerous grants and fellowships, including an International Affairs Fellowship from the Council on Foreign Relations. He also worked at the U.S. Congressional Office of Technology Assessment in Washington, D.C., and served as the Director of Research and Analysis at the Royal Institute of International Affairs, Chatham House in London. He has published 13 books. His recently published book is Across Time and Space, American Grand Strategies in Comparative Perspective. His current projects include a new book on European strategies in dealing with China and the US. Professor Reich has published in several major journals, including International Affairs, International Organization, and International Security. He also serves as co-editor of the Oxford Studies in Grand Strategy. Welcome, Professor Reich.
Thank you very much.
We have Hannah Gass. She has been working in DGAP, Center for Security and Defense. She currently works as a project officer in the Project Security and Stability in the Euro-Atlantic and Indo-Pacific Common Challenges and Opportunities for Cooperation. She studies political science in Göttingen and Hong Kong and international relations in Berlin and Christchurch, New Zealand. She wrote her master's thesis on unilateral security cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. Welcome, Hannah. So I would like to start this with Professor Reich, just a basic but a typical question for the grand strategy. What is the type of the for our general audience, please just give a definition or just how you would say that what is the grand strategy. And for this, how you will teach in the class or our audience that President Trump what type of grand strategy the US under the President Trump has been implementing. I don't know, and maybe many of us don't know, is the reciprocity or the basic type of the grand strategies that I also read in one of your class. So, but I am, it's difficult for me to find what type of this. So I know you are the expert on the subject. So, and I also want to add with this question, maybe you can just explain it or tell us that later on. Do you think that this type of the strategy, what is the strategy that you will give the name today? And do you think that this strategy will be the new normal for the successive US governments?
So you want me to answer all of that in 3 minutes, right? Okay.
No, for the 6 or 7 minutes.
The best of luck, right? I understand.
Yes, this is
okay. So, so when I teach that aforesaid class that Indu mentioned just now, I usually focus on 5 or 6 different kinds of grand strategy, and I'm not going to go through them all now, but I will say, in an act of blatant self-advertising, that last book I wrote with Peter Dombrowski, which is a very thin book, which you can get probably for free on the internet across time, type, and space, we have succinct summaries of each of the major types of grand strategy. So it's a good teaching tool. And there were so many distributed free on the net that I'm not breaking any, intellectual property rights by saying that. Essentially, we look at five different kinds, right? Stretching from the most globally involved, which are primacy, liberal variants such as deep engagement, and sponsorship, which is the one that I tend to focus on, which is the newest, most novel. It focuses on the role of the United States following international laws. And although your audience may be skeptical about that, in a new book I've written with Peter, we demonstrate the various ways in which the United States has and hasn't done that. And then we move towards the more retrenchment types, such as restraint and isolationism. When it comes to the Trump administration itself and which type it tends to follow, I preface my comment by saying that no administration tends to follow one in isolation from any of the others. In fact, as we argued in a 2017 book, The End of Grand Strategy, these are often calibrated so that different kinds of grand strategies are in fact pursued according to different circumstances, and quite often administrations run them simultaneously. We in that sense, when we think about a grand strategy, we're better off contemplating what presidents follow in terms of what is commonly referred to as a doctrine, which mixture of them they tend to pursue. And in that context, when you look at the Trump administration, obviously there are key elements of isolationism involved, but also various other forms of strategies that entail a retrenchment strategy of restraint, coupled with the occasional primacist outburst. So if I could speak at greater length, I would obviously talk about examples of all of these in a little more detail. But substantially, when we, for example, look at the current American strategy in Venezuela, it looks much more like a traditional isolationist strategy. Isolationism in this case meaning of the Western Hemisphere in a traditional sense, rather than isolationism meaning simply stopping at the Mexican border. There's a big argument amongst Republicans themselves at the moment whether isolationism just means the Mexican border or whether it stretches throughout the hemisphere down to Tierra del Fuego and the southern tip of Latin America. Isolationism is often misunderstood in the sense that, yes, it focuses on border security, but it does allow for global forms of diplomacy and negotiation. And that's what we're witnessing at the moment in the Indo-Pacific as Trump goes from one country to another, trying to negotiate agreements, whether they're trade agreements or otherwise. But I think the only thing I didn't address in your original question was, well, what is grand strategy? And of course, the answer to that question is there is no agreement. It's the vision thing. We know that. So as I teach my students, we go from grand strategy to individual strategies to foreign policy to tactics and then to behavior. So if you imagine a whiteboard moving across with arrows from one to another causally, that's how it's supposed to work. But the contents of those really vary according to the five different approaches, right? So Barry Posen, famous advocate of restraint, says, a nation prioritizes its greatest military threats and works according to those military threats. For example, what constitutes the greatest threats to national security? Many will argue in Washington, there's almost bipartisan agreement that the greatest military threat the United States faces is China. If you asked Trump personally, at least based on his behavior, he would say it's it's economic insecurity, and fentanyl. So in that context, we see, again, three different realist formulations: primacy, restraint, and isolationism, and they can't even agree on what the content is. Peter and I focus on the third I mentioned, sponsorship, and in the context of sponsorship, we think of much more in terms of collective action problems, which extends to anthropogenic threats such as climate change, and naturogenic threats such as pandemics. But in most traditional realist formulations, it's just about variants of military threats. And even the liberal variant, deep engagement, focuses on military threats plus human rights, but doesn't go much further than that. It certainly doesn't go into aspects such as climate change or pandemics. So, part of the problem of grand strategy as a research program is you have to start with a basic definition, and we don't even have agreement about that.
Thank you, Professor. It's really helpful, right, in the present scenario, what's going on. Like once the most of that you mentioned that most of the in Washington, most of the strategists, they are agree that China is the biggest threat for the U.S. But if personally, if someone wants to ask the President Trump, I guess he doesn't consider China as a threat, but at the same time, he is putting the sanctions against China frequently due to that you mentioned, the economic security, economic insecurity, and the rare earth materials. That is the biggest challenge for the United States, and that's why they want to move all the chip making companies from Taiwan to some other places. Yeah. So, but somewhere President Trump also thinks that China is the biggest threat. Maybe he doesn't want to show it publicly because the science that shows us that not the Russia, but the China is competing, and it's for the power transition, or the that's the region that China is coming. And maybe you also touched upon the Latin American countries. We will maybe, if the time allows, then we will ask the one questions over from the Latin American countries and what's going on in the U.S. strategy towards the Venezuela and Argentina, and is the China influence is also there. So thank you so much for your very genuine answer. I would just move towards the Hannah. Hannah, just first initial question focusing on the German Chancellor Merz. Like I found him quite aggressive on the European competitiveness and making a coalition of Europe, and he also talked a bit authoritative tone to the President Trump when he visited DC, and also recently German foreign minister's visit to India, extending its cooperation and collaboration to the Indo-Pacific countries like Japan. But do you see that how the Germany or and aggregate, if we say the European countries, they are navigating the challenge of parting itself from the US in the Indo-Pacific? And do you see there is a particular or a special space they are making without the United States, or what you think? So what's your thoughts? Please go ahead.
Yes, thank you so much. And thank you as well for the kind invitation to this discussion. Good afternoon from Berlin. So yeah, I hope I can share a bit the German or like European perspective on these topics. So I think what you mentioned about our Chancellor Merz and also the Foreign Minister Wadefuhl, especially in contrast with our former government under Scholz, I think you can see some more foreign policy drive, I would almost say, the necessity to become more independent of not only the US on the one hand, but also China on the other, hence the outreach to a partner like India. So I think there's definitely some development there. And I mean, under the proclaimed Zeitenwende that Scholz announced after the outbreak of the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine, I think there has been a lot of movement in terms of security, and there has really been a realization that maybe the US isn't the reliable security partner that we always thought it was. And I mean, to be fair, this is not just a development that is happening under the second Trump term, but that is something that has been in the making for quite a while now. The deprioritization of Europe and the move towards China, towards the Indo-Pacific. So I think it's nothing that should really strike us as such a surprise. And I think it took quite a long time to really, become aware that this is the development that is happening, and that the US under Trump and possibly any other president as well will move away from Europe. And I mean, so far, I think we haven't seen any of the nightmares that Europeans have had for the past months become materialized. So Trump has not removed any troops from Europe yet. NATO is still a thing. So I think maybe it's not quite as bad as some have anticipated. Nevertheless, I think the message really came through that Europe needs to deal with its own security to a larger extent, even though, of course, it's really hard without the US to achieve. And the outreach of Germany under Wadefuhr as well. I mean, I'm not sure if you've heard, but our foreign minister was actually supposed to visit China today, and he actually just canceled the trip because the Chinese side had canceled beforehand quite a few or almost all of the meetings that were planned, and has also asked Wadefuhr to not criticize China on its actions in the South China Sea. So I think under this new government, there's a bit more, maybe more self-confidence to actually not, let China do whatever it likes and to actually cancel this meeting. I think it has been the right move. Nevertheless, I mean, we will talk about that later on as well, but Europe is, quite busy with security and defense on its own continent. So I think there's only a very limited capability to look into the Indo-Pacific. And as someone who works on security in the Indo-Pacific, this can be quite frustrating sometimes, because of course our capabilities are very limited, and the military role that Europe or Germany can play in the Indo-Pacific is as well. But I mean, I think we will have a few questions on that later, so we can dive into that more. So basically, in a nutshell, I mean, a lot has happened, and there is, I think Europeans have woken up to an extent, but there's also, of course, a large necessity to become less dependent on, not just China economically, but also the US.
Thank you, Anna. That's interesting. I read in the morning that the foreign minister's visit is cancelled, but didn't know that, okay, China is cancelled that meeting. Thank you for updating this and for your answer.
Sorry, just to clarify, China didn't cancel the visit, but just a few of the engagements that were supposed to be part of the visit. So in the end, there would have been only one meeting, I think. So that's when our foreign minister decided not to make the trip.
Okay. That's very interesting. Like now the Canada's foreign minister is going. They are just making some changes in their Indo-Pacific strategy that Justin Trudeau did earlier. They just don't want to put China as a threat for the Canada, but it's a strategic partner. So it's very interesting. Like if what is West? Even I will ask Professor right now. What is West? What does it mean, West, like Canada or not the European partners? So I will take this question later on, but first I would like to invite Ursula. She has some question for Professor Rai.
Yes, I would like to follow up a question to Professor Rai, particularly we early on when you were giving a definition about the grand strategy, you talked about how there is no agreed upon definition on it. So looking at what President Trump is currently doing, trying to negotiate his own deals, we can say that there is this potential transatlantic grand bargain in a way, instead of a grand strategy, grand bargain that is possibly highly unlikely due to the administration's determination to make partnerships in ways that we could say disproportionately benefit the US. So given Mrs. Guerra's answer, how can we see Europe and other countries effectively use instruments like the anti-coercion instrument to respond to potentially US retaliatory tariffs without fracturing the necessary alignment for Indo-Pacific cooperation? So how can we navigate the US grand bargain type of strategy?
Yeah, it's okay. So simple question, a complicated answer. We lived through a Cold War period where essentially in a bipolar system, us and the Soviet Union, us meaning the United States and the Soviet Union, allies were located on one side or the other, with, of course, the division of Germany. And essentially, if you were allied with the United States on a military basis, you were also ostensibly, despite discord within European countries, you were allied with the United States diplomatically and economically. And then we moved through a post-war, post-Cold War period in which we talked about unipolarity, and the assumption was that the United States could impose its will. Now we've moved into a new period. People argue about whether it's bipolarity, multipolarity. The occasional outlier still wants to think about it in terms of unipolarity. Richard Higgett and I answer that it's we've entered a new period which we characterize as fuzzy bifurcation. Fuzzy bifurcation, why do we use that title? Because now we see a situation in which countries, and we can put Europe within this context, ostensibly, despite the efforts of the Chinese and the Americans to impose some kind of will, the Chinese, tried wolf warrior diplomacy and then had to abandon it because it was so ineffective. Trump is trying some variant of that right now, and he, I believe, is going to discover that he has to abandon it as well. But one of the characteristic features of fuzzy bifurcation is that, yes, bifurcation is taking place in the sense that China and the United States are still by far materially the most effective powers. But their capacity to impose their will is highly limited. And so in the context of, let's take Europe as an example, because that's the focus of today's talk. In the context of Europe, it means that Europe, and in this case, I'm talking about the EU rather than talking about individual countries, although the same logic applies. The EU will employ a variance of strategies according to the policy domain that we look at. So the Europeans are desperate in the short term to carry on bandwagoning with the United States because the initiatives that Europe has brought in terms of security and defense, for example, the strategic compass, right, has a longer time frame. At best, European projections through the Geopolitical Commission of the EU is that most of the initiatives that they're pursuing today, strategic security-wise, will not come into effect until after 2030. So the Europeans have a problem between now and minimally 2030 before they can secure before they can achieve security unilaterally. But when it comes to issues like trade, climate change, digitalization, the Europeans will have employed a variety of different strategies. And we can label them. We can call them hedging. We can call them counterbalancing in the case of the United States against the United States periodically in the realm of climate change, right? So when Obama and Biden are in office, they tend to go along with the United States on climate change initiatives. When Trump is in office, they counterbalance more towards the Chinese. So we see a variation in the European strategies in dealing with that. And so we use the term fuzzy for fuzzy bifurcation because neither American or Chinese efforts to cajole and bully, nor their efforts at charm offensives work particularly well. And so you see, European countries hedging back and forth between them. You'll get for every Orban, right, supporting Trump's agenda, you'll get Sanchez in Spain opposing it. You'll get promises for NATO increases in defense spending to 5%, although those won't even go into effect long after even probably Trump is no longer president, unless like he's like the president of Cameroon and he expects to go on till he's 99 years old. So in that context, we see significant variations. The Europeans, when it comes to trade, sorry, Chris, to directly answer that part of your question, when it comes to trade, the Europeans are desperately trying to hedge, right? That is, they value, and they have come to increasingly value their trade relations with the Chinese. I remember the story that Angela Merkel visited Beijing during her extended prime ministership, pardon me, of Germany. She visited Beijing more often than she visited Washington. Okay. And that gives you a sense of where this has been trending for an extended period. So the Europeans will desperately try and avoid using instruments like the Anti-Coercion Act against the Americans if they can possibly avoid it. But at the same time, walk a very delicate line. They had to abandon their free trade agreement with the Chinese because they stood up for their human rights issues. And it was a principled decision at the time, but I think one in retrospect, in the cold light of day, they may somewhat have regretted because they were sleepwalking through various American presidents complaining about their lack of investment in defense. And subsequent to that sleepwalking, they finally found themselves in a very uncomfortable position with Trump because of his tariffs. There are no short-term easy solutions for the Europeans, either in trade or in security. Their investment, and we can talk later on about their investments in defense specifically, but how likely, and Hannah is probably more effective at answering that question than I am, but how likely their investments in defense are likely to bear fruit is very problematic.
Thank you so much for your answer. I think it is quite comprehensive, but I wanted to further ask, you presented the question from by looking at European powers through the lens of the European Union. However, there are the big four powers, so the UK and France, which are residential powers in the Indo-Pacific, and then Germany and Italy, which are substantially involved but non-resident powers. So they have, and because the European Union might be a supranational body, there is still a lot of sovereignty by its nation that is taken into consideration. So this divergent national security priorities amongst these big four, could they complicate, for example, NATO's or the EU's efforts to establish a more singular and coherent strategy towards the Indo-Pacific? Which is quite a complex question.
Yeah, I will take this question if I may. Yeah, so I mean, I think first of all, it needs probably to be said that NATO itself, I mean, is of course dependent on its member states' decisions. So NATO, as of now, doesn't really see itself having a large role in the Indo-Pacific. I mean, there has been increased coordination with the so-called IP4 partners, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. But NATO, or like NATO itself, doesn't view itself as an Indo-Pacific player, and it's actually a no-go for NATO to put sort of Russia and China into the same basket. And NATO has also clearly stated that Taiwan, for instance, is not a NATO issue. So I think that needs to be said beforehand. However, among European countries, of course, there's I think definitely some stark disparities towards the Indo-Pacific. I mean, you said yourself that France and the UK are resident countries to an extent. I mean, France views itself as an Indo-Pacific power. It has overseas territories in the region, and France has actually very strongly advocated for strategic autonomy in the Indo-Pacific region, and for like a non-NATO role, and like a distinct European role from the US. So I think France is probably the strongest advocate for this strategic autonomy. I mean, there has been some cooperation between European countries on the Indo-Pacific, of course, and Germany itself, for example, has sent some deployments in recent years, some military deployments, and also trained with Indo-Pacific partners, and has also deployed aircraft together with the French and the Spanish, for example. So there's definitely mutual interest, but I think the extent really to which the countries are willing and capable to really play a role in the Indo-Pacific is quite different. I mean, Germany has its Indo-Pacific strategy as well, but other than a deployment here or there, of course, not the military means to really be active in the region, other than maybe like, you know, through a deployment once per year, which is basically more symbolic. So basically, to answer your question, I think there's not really, I mean, there's some countries that are willing to engage more, but I don't really see a NATO joint NATO action in the foreseeable future.
Thank you.
Professor, like, you want to add something on this question?
Yeah, if I may follow up just very briefly, you know, you have to distinguish clearly between material capabilities that Hannah referred to and symbolic statements, right? So, you know, the Macron characteristically has constantly talked about strategic autonomy, and one domain in which he's tried to apply that to is the Indo-Pacific, on the grounds that the islands that you see advertised on French meteo weather reports every night, you know, these small islands and part of, as you say, a residency. But characteristically, prior to Trump, right, the actions of the Germans, the British, and the French has been confined to participating in freedom of navigation operations in the South and East China Sea, which I hasten to add, they refuse to call FONOPs, or freedom of navigation operations, because they don't want to be identified with the Americans in that regard. And one shouldn't underestimate the symbolic importance of, say, you know, a French or a German. I think the German aircraft carrier, or the German ship Weymouth, I think it was called, you know, passed through the Taiwan Straits, etc., etc. Hannah will correct me on the details if I got that wrong, but passed through the Taiwan Straits. Yeah, symbolically, that's very important because it sends a message to the Chinese. But in terms of the American position, I hope I'm not jumping ahead here, but the American position has clearly been that the Americans seek a division of labor. And in the context of the division of labor, that they want the Europeans to focus on Europe. They don't want a NATO in that sense for the Indo-Pacific, or if they do want something that approximates a NATO, it doesn't include the Europeans, paradoxically. The Quad under the Biden administration was seen as embryonic. So this isn't even a partisan point by Trump. This is a sort of bipartisan American position that's been growing. I personally think that position is foolish, because while the European contribution to some Indo-Pacific NATO might be marginal, it provides a force multiplier that could, under certain circumstances, be quite valuable. And of course, its symbolic importance could be significant for the Chinese. But there's no doubt that the Ukraine war has forced the Europeans, I believe, to focus their attention rather more, making the idea of spreading their resources into the Indo-Pacific all the more difficult, certainly in the short to medium term, and therefore providing the opportunity for the Americans, and particularly the Trump administration. Hegseth and Elbridge Colby, the Undersecretary for Defense and Policy, have been very strident and very clear in the fact that they don't want European involvement. Why? I don't know. But if we look at American policymakers and American scholars, such as Barry Posen, right? Going back to a wonderful 2019 article that I love to quote, to use in my courses, where he says, we should let go of Europe. The Europeans can defend themselves. In the context of what's come since, it looks like a quite problematic article. But I think that article, if anybody's interested in the audience, I think it was in Survival, which is, of course, a British journal. They might find it interesting. Every American president, I once tried, did a little bit of research work about American presidents complaining about Europeans not spending enough money on defense. And I managed to trace it back to every American president since John F. Kennedy in 1963, I think, complaining about the Europeans. In fact, no, I correct myself. I think I got as far back as Dwight D. Eisenhower complaining even before him. So this has been a long-running story, and I guess if you look at the long arc of history, you would have to say that Trump's threats were a long time coming. The only difference between him and his predecessors, including American presidents who've been major proponents of ensuring European security, like Hillary Clinton, they all complained about the Europeans not spending enough money. So you could say it was only a matter of time. And I don't want to monopolize, but we can go back at some point if you're interested and say, why did the Europeans not hear this message, right, coming?
If I might add to this, so
Please.
First of all, on the German frigate and symbolism, it was the frigate Baden-Württemberg, I believe. So it's funny because it was actually a huge discussion in Berlin whether or not the frigate should pass through the Taiwan Strait or not, or whether this wouldn't be too provocative an act towards China, and whether or not China wouldn't act or react with retaliatory measures to this. And it's funny because there was so much discussion about this, and in the end the frigate did sail through the Taiwan Strait, and there was not really any reaction at all from the Chinese. And I mean, it wasn't an illegal act, right? It was international waters. So I think the fact itself that there was so much fear about this and discussion is already interesting. And then on symbolism and on European actions in the Indo-Pacific, I of course agree that the priority for Europeans is Europe and Ukraine and the northeastern flank in Europe. However, I think European engagement in the Indo-Pacific is not just to like, you know, do or not do something because of the US. It's also in the self-interest of Europe to, you know, keep sea lines of communication open and to engage more with the region, even though, of course, capabilities are limited. I think it's not something that Europe should do to, I don't know, try to convince the US of something, but it's something that Europe needs to do because security in the Indo-Pacific and developments there really affect European security. And I think this is something that is sometimes hard to make the case for in Europe, because of course the priority is on Russia and the Indo-Pacific still seems far away. So I just wanted to add that it's, if I got that point across, that it's should be in Europe's self-interest to even play a symbolic role there.
May I follow up very briefly with a point?
Sure.
You said the Chinese didn't react. I just posed this as a proposition. The Chinese, in fact, did react. And the way they reacted was to withdraw their 9-dash line into a 10-dash line, which included the Taiwan Straits. So their claim, of course, is, you said quite rightly, well, the Europeans did not, the Germans in this case, did not break international law. But the Chinese withdrew their 9-dash line into 10 so that they at least claimed that as territorial water, and therefore subsequently claimed that any further examples of that would be in transgression of international law because they were claiming sovereignty over the region. So it was a subtle response, but it was but it wasn't a timely response. But it would be very interesting today to see whether the British, the French, or the Germans would do the same thing again, because of their concern about a potential violent, or a violent, sorry, wrong word, a potential aggressive diplomatic reaction. I don't know whether they would or not, but it'll be interesting to see.
I mean, I'm not sure if the 10-dash line was an immediate reaction to the German frigate.
No, it could be a combination of factors, of course.
No, I just think that, or what this has shown is that it's, you know, it's important to have, how do the Indo-Pacific partners call it, more eyes on the region, you know, and by not looking at the Taiwan Strait and not sailing through the Taiwan Strait, I think it's an even clearer signal to China, and it would have probably rearranged this 9-dash line either way, right? So I don't think it would have not done it had there not been sails through the strait.
Okay, yeah, that's quite a great interesting point about Taiwan, but we will move towards later on if time allows, because we have more questions regarding Taiwan, as President Trump claims that Xi Jinping told him that China won't invade Taiwan until President Trump is in Oval Office. So that's the one thing, but we don't know at this. Just I want to move towards Professor Reich about the recent ASEAN summit. President Trump's presence in Asia is a very significant at this point. Earlier we were at this point because we haven't heard that Japan's new prime minister, instability in Japan, even the relations with India are not that going smoothly, even like the far worse. Then the Biden administration and the next Quad summit that was scheduled in India, in Delhi, in November, I guess, and there is no confirmation of President Trump will be attending the Quad. That was very important grouping that President Trump in his first term established the Indo-Pacific strategy. The term Indo-Pacific somehow coming from the many strategists and prime ministers. So we can say that in his first term, he revived the Quad grouping. But now at this time, Even the Japan followers, they are hoping that the new prime minister will be making some alignments in comparison to the predecessor Ishiba. So how do you see that the President Trump's presence in Asia and meeting with the ASEAN, that is a very important group of the Southeast Asian countries, and then Japan and the Seoul. And last, your comment on the Quad is that will be the diminishing the Quad if President Trump doesn't attend the Quad summit in India coming months in November or December. How do you see the President Trump's Indo-Pacific strategy that from his first term to the second term? Is there shift? Is there some addendum?
Yeah, well, first of all, I should point out that Hannah is the expert on minilateralism and therefore presumably the Quad. So I'm going to try and keep my answers purposefully brief to hand it over to her and let her address it more fully. But from the American perspective, right, the focus is quite clearly on bilateral relations, right? Regardless of whether we're talking about one of the Southeast Asian nations or we're talking about Canada, for example, right? It's all economically based, it's all tariff based. Within the White House, as I mentioned before, within the Department of Defense, as I mentioned before, the clear focus is on China. Just to reiterate what I said before, one of the very small areas of agreement in Washington between not only Democrats and Republicans, but people in government and think tanks, right, is it's all about China. And so, as I suggested, under fuzzy bifurcation, you've got to have elements of a charm offensive, which the Chinese are trying, and Trump's trip through Asia at the moment, to the multilateral fora, like the ASEAN meeting of the ASEAN countries, is some effort at charm offensive. The video of Trump dancing, back and forth as he arrived yesterday will surely spawn 1,000 memes on social media, right? You see, you're all smiling because you're just thinking of them in much more effectively than me. But when it comes to the bilateral relations, Trump still thinks he can bully. Okay, he can use coercive instruments, and I'm sure that when he's talking to the Japanese, when in these individual meetings, he's talking about trade relations rather more than security relations. It tends to be our focus today on the security aspects. But Modi's response, you mentioned the Indians, and Modi's response is very telling, right? Because he went to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting recently, and the bonhomie he expressed as he held hands with the Chinese and the Russians was purposefully designed to send a message to Trump that India is not prepared to be bullied. And many commentators, particularly Indian commentators that I read afterwards, seemed to suggest that this was a turning point in the relationship between India and the United States. I'm not as convinced. I think that Modi is, strategically, in terms of skill and will, rather more effective than that. And I don't think he's going to jettison 20 years of American-Indian security relations on the basis of that. But he's trying to send a message. Whether his signal to the Americans is effective or not, in part will lie with the capacity of the Trump administration to understand the message. And we have no guarantee that they will, because they tend to be driven rather more transactionally and sometimes emotionally, as we saw with the case of Trump not liking an advert in Canada and so increasing tariffs. on Canada because he didn't like an advert. You know, we can't imagine any American president in recent history behaving like that. So what is the future of the Quad? Well, the Quad was, I would have been rather more optimistic about the future of the Quad under Biden. But Trump is so mercurial that it's hard to predict at the moment which way it will go. You know, when people get into prediction, it's great. It makes headlines. It doesn't necessarily bear out in the long term, you know, and anybody that says they understand what the future of the Quad will be, I would be rather skeptical.
I mean, I would have probably said the exact same thing. We simply don't know whether this Quad summit will happen or not, and how the Trump-Modi fallout will affect it or not. I think just generally under the second Trump administration, there has been definitely less emphasis and less appetite for multilateral cooperation, also for the trilateral relationship with Japan and South Korea. So who knows, maybe this trip might change things and put Asia or like multilateralism more on the agenda again. But I would agree, we simply don't know, and we will probably have to wait and see, as frustrating as this sounds as an answer.
Sure, thanks. And now the last question from the Cressida. Please go ahead.
Yes, I would like to, summing up some of the points, Professor Ike made a comment about the US not necessarily wanting Europe in the Indo-Pacific, but on the other hand, we also have European engagement being generally welcome, because they are generally perceived as the third way of promotion of mutual interest, rather than merely aligning too closely with US strategic positions, which are quite hawkish in a way and provocative towards China. So in a two-parter question, one is, what should Europe do in matters of policy adjustment to assure its own economic and security initiatives, but also what should happen for the collective ability of the transatlantic community to counter China's increasingly assertive behavior and economic coercion in the Indo-Pacific region?
So first Professor Reich, and then Hannah will make the comments, and then we will conclude.
I defer. Hannah, you go first, and then I'll mop up if I have anything further to add. But I have some response, but go ahead.
Sure. No, I think that's that's actually Europe's or the EU's strength, to not to be like a third partner, and to not basically join, even though of course it is all about geopolitics, to not come across as a geopolitical actor, but as like a values partner, or like an economic partner, or a partner in climate policy. So I always like to use the South Pacific, or like the Pacific Islands, as an example, where both China and the US, and of course other countries, are trying to influence the local nations, and trying to like buy their support basically. And I think in this power game, basically Europe can and should present itself as a somewhat normative actor, and collaborate also on topics that are actually advancing the needs of the local nations. For example, in the South Pacific, this would be, of course, climate resilience. And I think that would actually play into Europe's strengths a little bit, to be more of a values-based and normative partner, rather than trying to deter China in the region. Of course, it is about deterring China to an extent, but I think Europe can sort of go a third way and distinguish itself from China and the US.
I'm going to answer the last question being highly provocative in that regard. So, Hannah, well, I welcome your opportunity to come back and tell me I'm wrong, but I think the age of normative power Europe is well gone. You know, you can look at various different things amongst the EU in terms the formation of the EU's geopolitical commission, right, 4 or 5 years ago as a starting point under von der Leyen, and say that the Europeans, coming back to some of the points I touched on earlier, the European effort to distinguish itself from the United States in the Indo-Pacific is highly contingent, and it's largely contingent according to which domain that we look at, right? So if we look at digitalization, the Europeans have been able to distinguish themselves through the GDPR, et cetera, and they formulated what can best be characterized as a different ecology for the internet, et cetera, and compared to Europe and China. But I don't want to use words like muddling through, but when it comes to trade, for example, the Europeans, as I mentioned before, are walking a fine line. It's very hard to imagine the Europeans being able to distinguish themselves on the basis of values or otherwise in the Indo-Pacific when it comes to security, because the kind of values that the Europeans have historically projected, human rights, democracy, et cetera, just isn't playing well. And it isn't playing well anywhere, not just in the Indo-Pacific. Maybe small outposts where this resonance with human rights values, et cetera, plays, well in the context of places like Taiwan, obviously. But beyond that, I can't imagine scenarios where the third, what did you call it? The third way, the third European way of distinguish itself from the Americans and the Chinese as a general rubric is going to work very well. And I also think that despite the occasional echoes from Brussels, we don't see that we see it with less frequency than we used to under von der Leyen's presidency. It strikes me that if I was going to make a generalization, which I'm hesitant to do, it's moved far more towards the geopolitical and rather more pragmatic than the sort of Ian Manners normative power profile that the Europeans projected for several decades.
I mean, I completely agree that it's a pragmatic engagement. However, I would still say that there's still ways to basically distinguish yourself or like European action from, say, Chinese engagement by simply, talking to local partners what their needs are and not just offering. I mean, I'm coming back to the South Pacific, but not offering ready-made solutions, but really like engaging with partners and asking what their needs are and what their interests are and what their priorities are. So maybe I'm being too optimistic in this, but
well, I get your point about small islands in the South Pacific and climate change, and in fact one of the ones that I thought about was the EU, as you spoke, was the EU providing assistance to the Coast Guard in the Philippines, for example, right? And I can think of those small examples, but I mean this with sincerity, not rhetorically. I would love to see a list from you of those kind of EU initiatives. I know we don't have time now, but those kinds of EU initiatives, because maybe they get drowned out and I'm missing something, but I suspect with a low degree of confidence that I'm right, that the European efforts to distinguish themselves are really focusing on trade rather than values, right? And the problem is the Europeans got themselves in a catch-22 because they link trade to human rights. And now they have to dig themselves out of that hole because the Chinese don't want to know about human rights. The Chinese want trade with the Europeans for sure, right? It's a market that's been of growing importance to them as they try and retrace their steps in the United States and reduce any dependency on the United States. But the Chinese are much more focused on Latin America and Africa at the moment. And so I see reduced European leverage in that domain as well.
Yes, exactly. And just you mentioned earlier, Professor Reich, that France only island, that Macedonia in the Pacific island, that also have some issues of autonomy and citizenships, French citizenship they have been demanding for the years. So that always, Macron always says that France is the resident power, but the island itself has some issues that I guess the France needs to take the attention on that one to resolve those issues.
I mean,
And
sorry, I apologize.
Yeah, sure, please.
I want to stress that I completely agree with Hannah in the realm of climate change, right? Where, I think the Europeans are on much stronger ground. And these are areas where they can collaborate not only with those outposts that we talked about, in climate mitigation, but also with the Chinese, right? More importantly, from the big picture stuff. I think if I was sitting in Brussels and I said, what's the one area where we should focus on amplifying our position? That would be it, right? Because the Europeans are really on much stronger ground. I just worry that beyond that, it's very hard.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think our time is almost up. I want to thank you tremendously for this session. I wish I could go more on because I do have some follow-up questions, but unfortunately, due to time, that won't be possible.
Well, I hope you'll invite us both back for an opportunity to address your other questions, please.
That would be wonderful. So I would like to thank you both for the quite dialectical discussion as well. You're opposing, not tremendously opposing, but it was wonderful to see the two different, especially in the last closing comments, the two different perspectives. That is my personal thanks to you. I would like to give the space to Dr. Saxena.
Thank you, Priscilla, and wonderful and interesting session, Hannah and Professor Reich. We will definitely invite you again, and for your comments.
You see, Hannah, for better or worse, I got you an invitation back. I apologize.
Yeah, that is a very productive and interesting session. Thank you so much for your time, and we'll share the recording soon.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
Thank you again.